Thanks so much, Anthony. And Giulio, it's lovely to see you. Always lovely to see you. And let's dive straight in. Anthony alluded to this early on. And well, first of all, you are by training and trade a scientist and a climate scientist. And there is science in the book, and quite a lot of it, and something rather mind-blowing. But there's also everything else, it feels like. There's history, there's geopolitics, there's culture, there's philosophy. And it is indeed, as the title would suggest, a biography of water. But why did you decide to tell the story in that way?
Yeah, well, so Bianca, it's lovely to see you as always, and thank you, Anthony, for that kind introduction. And great to be with all of you. I can't, we obviously, Bianca and I can't see you, but we are hoping that we'll be able to entertain you for the next hour or so. So why did I write the book? Well, there's many ways of explaining this, but let me start maybe by framing where we are today and sort of how I responded to it. You will all have seen the news of late. Let's just take the last summer as an example. We've had catastrophic fires due to severe water scarcity in the west of the United States, in Greece, in Turkey. We've had, both the Rhine and the Yellow River leave their embankments over the course of the summer. Some of you will have seen the Storm Ida come through, New Orleans, and then the city of New York just a few weeks ago, and then ultimately, I think just a few days ago, sort of whatever was left of that tropical storm making its way to the UK, and in fact raining through the ceiling of my living room. And so, we are in a world in which water is becoming more central to the news that we see about the world. And there are two things that are going on there, and two things that I've experienced in working on water security over the last 15 years. The first, of course, is that the climate system is changing. We know that I started working on climate issues in the late 90s, and this is not a surprise for those of us who have been working on these issues. The climate system has as its principal agent on the landscape water. Right? So floods and droughts and storms, those are all expressions of the climate system's agency on the landscape. And so it's not surprising that as the climate system changes, as the composition of the atmosphere changes, as the average temperature changes, we see that manifested primarily through changes in the world of water. But then the other thing that's happening is that the institutions and infrastructure that we built over many years to deliver water security to ourselves, to make sure that we can sort of ignore water in our daily lives. Well, those institutions and that infrastructure is failing, right? And that realization that we have these two kind of this nexus of these two trends happening right now was in some ways the motivation for writing this book, because I wanted to find a way of explaining why this mattered, how it mattered, and how should people start thinking about how to respond. And the conclusion that I came to is that what we're seeing now is the sort of terminus of a relationship that's been happening for 10,000 years. When it first started, when we became sedentary 10,000 years ago, we decided to stand still in a world of moving water, as it were. And ever since, we've wrestled with this massive agent of the climate system on the landscape, water. And so I wanted to tell the story of how we got to where we are today over time, over the centuries, explaining how we developed the institutions and infrastructure that is currently failing us, so that we can then have a discussion about where we might go next. And so in doing that, I ended up, Bianca, I ended up sort of exercising a bit of archaeology of ideas. Turns out the story of water is not really a story of science, it's not really a story of engineering. It's a story about us, and it's a story about our ideas about the landscape and how we live together in it. And that's really the story that I tell in the book.
It's rather beautiful, actually, and it's true. I wouldn't. It has all the drama in it as well, that you might associate with a relationship, a relationship evolving over millennia. Right, I am now going to jump to and I'd love if you can throw some examples in here, because I love some of the stories that you tell through the book. But water as almost a giver of identity, and from antiquity. First of all, I'd love some, a bit of the antiquity there because it's just so rich. But then also, how does that manifest today? Where does it still show up in cultural traits or in iconography or just in who we are and how we live? That identity component of the water that we live with.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that, as I try to dig through the layers of, institutions and ideas that we've accumulated over time, inevitably what I'm doing is not really the work of a historian as much as of a narrator. And so I'm taking today and I'm looking back in time, trying to see the seeds of the story that end today, right? So it's a narrative exercise more than a scientific exercise. But one of the things that I realized is that stories are the kind of most resilient and long-lasting vector for information in kind of our civilizations and our societies. And so if you're looking for traces of this kind of complicated relationship with water going back in time, you end up sort of in the world of myths and in the world of kind of storytelling. I'm reminded, by the way, I mean, this is a kind of side note, but there is one story that I encountered as I was starting to write this book, which is from the Klamath tribe in southern Oregon in the west of the United States. And it's a story of the formation of a great lake. It's told in the form of a myth. But it so happens that we also know, kind of scientifically, we know from geology which lake those stories refer to. It's a lake called Crater Lake in Oregon. It's one of the deepest lakes in the world, actually. And we know that it formed 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, which then tells us that a story can survive and carry information at least 6,000 or 7,000 years, right? Which is extraordinary if you think about it. I mean, I used to write scientific papers, and I doubt I can hope that those will last more than 20 or 30 years. But stories and narration can really outlive most civilizations and societies. And so I started looking back in time, and maybe the best place to start is a very famous story, which was originally written on a tablet, which is actually at the British Museum, just a few miles from where I'm speaking from, which is a tablet that came from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. It's written on a tablet of the 7th century BCE, but it probably refers to stories that go back to at least the 2nd millennium, if not maybe the 3rd millennium BCE, and sort of deep in the early dynastic or even Sumerian times. And it's the story of a man that was told by a god to build a boat to save himself, because of course, the gods were going to rain a massive deluge on the planet and erase everything on it. And so this man builds the boat and actually puts all of his animals on it. And then rain falls down, and he floats for days and days and days and nights and nights and nights. And eventually he sends out a dove to see if land has emerged again. And the dove comes back with a little branch in its beak. And the boat eventually lands on Mount Urartu, and the flood sort of drains away, and life begins again. Now, that story, which many of you will recognize as the story of Noah and the Great Deluge, is in fact the story of Utnapishtim, a great Mesopotamian patriarch, and it was written, amongst other things, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the writing of the Old Testament by probably 1,500 years. And when I started writing this book, I encountered dozens of these kinds of stories that sort of tell of a dramatic relationship between individuals and the world of water. It's not just the story of Noah and Utnapishtim. It's, in America, it's the stories that the various tribes, the Lenape tribe of Mannahatta, the original Manhattan inhabitants, they believed they originated from a people that had survived a great deluge. Or the Inca had a story about the Unupachacuti flood, which is a major flood that two brothers survived and sort of started a new civilization. And there's the Jade Emperor story of China. In fact, in China, there are many stories that relate great deluges and great floods to the origin of civilization, and so forth and on. Zeus and even Norse epics contain this story. So the first thing to say is that at the origin of our storytelling, even in the songlines of the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, you have this kind of idea that the starting point for living together, the starting point for society, is a relationship with water. Now, part of what I do in the book is I kind of lay out these seeds, these kind of cultural seeds, if you will, that the echoes of which have reached us today. But then I try to reconstruct how then through the generations, they end up building components of far more abstract and complicated identities. And so, for example, just to give you a couple of examples, the first sort of instance of what we today would call a national identity emerges in the kingdom of Egypt, in the ancient, in the first and middle kingdom of Egypt, when societies gets organized around transport on the Nile, thus creating the first sort of national borders in a sense. I talk about the development of Abrahamic traditions in the Levant in a particularly scarce environment, and how the rules of ethics and morals that then have kind of transmitted all the way to today came from their experience of water. And then finally, Bianca, I realize I'm going on, I'm sort of warming to my theme here, but let me just say this last example before I come back to you. Probably the most important legacy that's incredibly salient to us today, which is the relationship between the particular hydrology that the Greek world and the Roman world experienced in the Mediterranean of the 6th, 5th, 4th, up to the 1st century BCE, and the development of institutions that in many ways, with appropriate caveats, are fundamentally governing our social life today. So the idea of democracy, the idea of a republic, all these institutions that reflect individual agency, individual political agency, emerge out of a very particular experience that those agrarian societies had with the rain-fed world of the Mediterranean. And so in a way, part of the point of the book is to kind of try and demonstrate that the DNA of our relationship with water is actually all around us. And it's all around the institutions that govern our life together.
Ah, yes, the institutions piece. Now we've had a question in the Q&A, and I am actually going to jump to it because it sort of reflects something that I was going to ask you as well. So this is from Joanna. And it says, the Anthropocene is often presented as the human attempt to control all aspects of nature. Some celebrate this, others bemoan it. Either way, what do you think, Giulio, is the appropriate attitude, ethical, political, spiritual, we should take towards water? And I'm going to add to that my part of the question, which is, can we achieve a manageable balance in our relationship with water and nature?
I'm a man of many doubts, and so I tend to shy away from prescriptions, particularly ethical and moral prescriptions. But I can give you kind of my sense and my opinions and my sort of beliefs about this. And maybe the right place to start is the latter part of the question, the one that you we asked, which is, can we in fact control nature? Because the story of the Anthropocene, intended not as in scientific terms, that is in terms of that moment in geology when we become a geological force, but rather in ethical and sort of functional terms, which is that moment where we become the controllers of nature, is actually a modernist dream. It starts at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's it's the promise of the 20th century hydraulic state. It has actually a very specific point in time and a very specific moment when it emerges. So let me expand on that for a second, because it's important to understand it. If you were a farmer living, in fact, as a matter of fact, living in England, but also living in the middle of America in 1900, your life would not have been measurably different from the life of somebody living in, I don't know, Italy, where I come from, in the 12th century. In reality, the vast majority of the energy that we were using was animal energy or human energy, and maybe fuel wood. You have very limited access to anything else. Your life expectancy wasn't all that better. But then something happened, and much of what happened was that the very powerful economic actor, the state, the 20th century state, which becomes the most powerful economic actor in human history in many ways, starts exercising extraordinary sovereignty over the environment. And this starts particularly in America, where the so-called conquest of the West, the colonization by people of European heritage of the western part of the country, required essentially a replumbing of the West. And that's when things like Hoover Dam happen, the American Canal, the sort of creation of the Californian and Western landscape. And it's so engineered that people in that part of the world, quite quickly, by the time you get to the 50s, could essentially pretend that nature was not variable. It was framed as a conquest of nature, and indeed, in many ways, it was intended to be a conquest of nature. It was the bargain that people made with a powerful federal sovereign. We give you power, we give you resources, in exchange, you will deliver security. Right? It's the famous Benjamin Franklin exchange. You give security in exchange for freedom, and it worked. Right? It worked so much so that it spread across the world. One of the things that I point out in the book is that until the 20th century, human societies developed quite a varied range of ways of dealing with water variability and their water environment. But by the time you get to the 20th century, we've all converged essentially on one, a heavily engineered landscape in which water for most people is something that's managed by somebody else and moves behind walls, behind levees and dams, behind embankments, and the variability of which we are protected from, right? So that we can live at the sole beat of industrialization and the consumer economy. Yeah, and I'm not actually making a comment as to whether it's good or bad. That also delivered enormous benefits in terms of poverty alleviation. It delivered, delivered modern life, and it delivered, much greater life expectancy. But it had a cost, and that cost was hidden for a long time, because we convinced ourselves, all of us, that that solution was eternal, that we had conquered nature once and for all, and that then connects back to the question that was just asked. The reality is that the last summer and the last few years have demonstrated that the illusion is breaking. All solutions, 10,000 years of history and 15 years of my own work on water security have taught me that water solutions are always provisional, and they always contain the seeds of the next problem. And that's exactly what's happened in the west of the US, and exactly what's happened in Europe. And so to answer your question, Bianca, we can't really control. It's a dynamic relationship. It's what some materialists would call a dialectic relationship between us and our collective action on the landscape and the actions of this agent of the climate system, water. And we're locked into this dance. That's a very dynamic process, and we're just in a moment of change. Somebody's taken a step, and we're now going to take the next one. And so, no, we haven't conquered nature. I think we'll never will. We'll always be in this dynamic relationship. And this poses very important political and ethical questions as to what do we want the future to look like. And they're susceptible to debate. They're susceptible to political debate. There is no single engineering or scientific theory that can tell you what the final answer, the final solution to this problem is going to be.
There is a brilliant question in the Q&A from Walter, who says, and I know the answer to this, and I really want you to expand on it as you do so magnificently, please, Giulio. Walter asks, is the origin of water touched on in this book? And you know that I get very excited about that bit.
I do, because in part because it's important for the story that I tell. So there are many theories about how water got on the planet. The Earth is in the inner solar system. So when it accreted out of the protostellar material that was left by the previous star, it was too close to the then young sun and too hot to have water on its surface. And so water must have appeared on the surface of the planet after it cooled. And there are two basic competing theories for how this happened. One is that water was present in the material that coalesced into the early planet, and then once it cooled, it degassed out of the interior. That's a sort of traditional view of the story, and in part it's based on the idea that water is present in all the planets of the solar system. We know that water must have been there before, because that's why we know that Mars has water. That's why we know that many of the external planets have water. But more recently, the more probable theory and the sort of stronger hypothesis is that water was delivered on the planet by a set of asteroids that reached the planet maybe around 3.8 billion years ago. The key thing here is, of course, that be that as it may, the implication is that water has been effectively fixed in quantity ever since. And that's a really important insight and important framing, because often people think of water in sort of shorthand as oil. They think of it as a scarce resource that we're going to run out. And of course, the problem is not that we're going to run out of water in the planet. The amount of water is fixed. And anytime any of you drink a sip of water, remember that it has probably gone through the kidneys of some dinosaur at some point, because it's, aside from some small amount of hydrolysis that loses, that breaks the molecule, most of the water has been essentially fixed. Most of it is in the oceans, of course, but its distribution in time and space is what matters. So the conversation about water is not really about the molecule as much as about our access to it as a society. And that is why this is a powerful dance, because of course the climate system redistributes continuously water in space and time. It evaporates somewhere, comes down somewhere else. And once we become sedentary, once we decide to stay put, stay fixed in a place, we have this problem of making sure that that place has sufficient supply of water to grow food and serve all of our needs, whilst at the same time protecting us from floods, right? From too much water when we don't need it. And the last thing I'll say about this, Bianca, is the other reason that origin story of water is important is because it also gives a sense of just how overwhelming the processes that involve water can be. Again, we think of water and we think of scarcity and we look around, and so there's a bit of a tendency of thinking that water is a fragile resource that requires our paternal stewardship. Of course, there's a sense in which that's true, but we have to remember that the processes that water is involved in on the planet vastly overwhelm even ours, the most technological civilization in human history. And so just as an example, I was talking about Ida as the storm Ida. Ida as a thermal engine, probably used on the order of the same amount of energy over its lifetime, roughly speaking, that the entire world economy uses in a year, right? The scale of the forces and energy involved in atmospheric and hydrological processes on the planet can vastly overwhelm anything that we can put in play. And that's why, this is a very unstable and precarious relationship that we're in. And, the events of the last few years have, just demonstrated that.
Yeah, let's talk about that now, because obviously, you said that you are the narrator of a story that ends today, but there are many ways in which a whole new chapter is beginning. And talk to us about water and its role in climate change, how it plays out from a scientific perspective, but then how it kind of manifests on people's actual lives, and what we need to think about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the reason I wrote the book now, and as I said, I'm a practitioner by trade, if you will. I mean, I worked on sort of water security issues in a number of countries around the world, and so why write a story? Why write a history book aside from my sort of interest? And partly it's because, as I said earlier, we are at this kind of juncture where we have ahead of us a number of choices, actually, and I strongly believe that these should be susceptible to public debate and to political discourse. And so I care deeply about the fact that water doesn't remain a technical issue in the hands of a few white-coated people, but that it's actually subjected to legitimate, and hopefully often democratic debate, right? And so there are two things happening here. One is that, as I said, the climate system is changing. Water is the principal greenhouse gas of the planet. People tend to forget this. I mean, we talk a lot about carbon dioxide, and of course, that's the principal, not the soul, but the principal anthropogenic gas that we emit in the atmosphere. But the reason carbon emissions have such a potential impact on the state of the planet is because its effect on the radiative balance of the atmosphere is then distorted and amplified by the presence of water. Because water is a gas in its vapor form, is a gas that's largely transparent to visible light, but it's largely opaque to infrared light. So it lets sun come through, and then it traps as a blanket the infrared radiation, the heat that comes out of the ground of the planet. And so, roughly speaking, the planet is warm and we can live on it because there is water on it. The amount of water in the atmosphere it determines that opacity, and the amount of water in the atmosphere is a function of the temperature. And so as something like carbon dioxide increases a little bit the temperature, that increases the amount of water in the atmosphere, right? The ability of the atmosphere to draw out water, which then increases its opacity further, which then increases the temperature even further, thus amplifying and creating a feedback, what's called a water vapor feedback. So on the one hand, what awaits us is a far more energetic water cycle, one in which the floods and droughts and the storms that we are accustomed to will probably change. We know that they might change in frequency. We think they might change in intensity. We believe that their distribution in space and time might shift, right? So that's kind of the first thing that happens. But then the second thing that happens, the place where we have most debate to have, is that as that sort of agent of the climate system shifts and changes, we then have a set of choices on how we're going to respond. Because what's going to happen is that the infrastructure that protects us and the institutions that we use to organize us and respond, in the UK, the DEFRAs of this world and the water inspectorate and the water utilities will likely be overwhelmed by these changes, and we'll need new investments, we'll need to change the institutions, we'll need to make new decisions, right? And that's where this matters a great deal. And I go to some extreme in the book to make the point that we might think these are just technical choices, but they're really about who lives where and what do we do on the landscape that constitutes our home. And whereas if you're sitting in Newcastle or Oxford or in London, as I do, you might think that these are sort of things that you can think about in the context of sort of, existing democratic institutions. The fact of the matter is, around the world today, there is a real race for which model countries are going to pursue in managing these problems. And right now, the most popular one, particularly in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where I and you, Bianca, have worked a fair amount, is the one that's been exported by China, which is in many ways a prosecution of the modernist dream that the Americans had invented in the first half of the 20th century, and that they've sort of taken on steroids, right? So just as one final anecdote on this point, if Hoover Dam was the sort of archetype piece of infrastructure of the early part of the 20th century and sort of represented that conquest of nature in that moment, well, the Three Gorges Dam is the archetype modernist project of the 21st century. It shows that desire to conquer nature is still very much alive and well. Its principal driver, it's the principal plumber of the world, has now become China. And many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia are looking to that experience as the model that they should pursue. And in some cases that becomes an instrument of authoritarianism. In some cases it becomes an instrument of political repression. It's an expression of power, right? Deciding what happens on the landscape is an expression of power, and therefore it's a political issue, and therefore, I believe it needs to be subjected to scrutiny.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that power piece in a moment. I'm going to have a moment of levity first, and before that, even just as Anthony put in the chat, we'll be handing over to you all to ask questions shortly. So please do start popping your questions in the Q&A. Levity first, please, Giulio. I feel after it's a serious and important topic, and the book does talk about it so beautifully and lyrically, and also there's so many multifaceted. But I reserve the right to be a little light-hearted, and that is so. The question is, my favourite fact in the book was actually that the amount of water on the planet has been fixed for a very, very long time, and that was my favourite moment. But you have spent years and working in water, and then many, many, many hundreds and thousands of hours probably researching this book. Was there a moment where you were sitting in the British Library or sitting at your computer, and even you, with all of your experience, went, "Wow, I didn't realise that"?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think that I had that. It was, in fact, in the British Library. Funnily enough, you hit on the right institution there, and as I said earlier, it turns out that the variety or the diversity of solutions that human societies have developed over time to deal with water through collective action is far greater. That diversity is far greater than we see today on the landscape. Right? Today, we've all converged. Whether you're in Japan, in Italy, in the UK, or in America, fundamentally the tools of managing and delivering water security are all the same. They're based on levees and dams and catchments and sort of managing and storing water and so forth. But it turns out that that wasn't always the case. And one of the most surprising encounters I had was in researching the approach to water management that had been adopted by the populations that lived in the Amazon rainforest before the arrival of the Spanish, before the arrival of the colonial European powers. And this is a story that has only really emerged in the archaeological and anthropological literature in the last 20 or 30 years. For many, many years, people assumed that the Amazon was effectively a virgin forest where pretty much nobody lived, and if they did, they were sort of, stateless, disorganized, small tribal communities. Now, there were exceptions to this story. There's a really interesting 16th century text by a friar, Gaspar de Carvajal, who was a friar, and he traveled with a fellow called Francisco de Orellana, who was the first person to float down the Amazon River from its source all the way down to its mouth. I think it was in the 1540s. And Gaspar de Carvajal wrote a book about this, wrote a memoir essentially of his travels. Incidentally, that's where we get the name Amazon from. He thought they encountered a number of tribes along the way, and some of them they identified with the old Greek myth of the Amazons, and that's how the river got his name. But the thing that's interesting about the Carvajal's writing is that he described an Amazon that was densely populated. He writes of white cities and, thousands of people living on the banks and way inland. And for years, people thought he had essentially made it up, that it simply wasn't possible. Then it turned out that, in fact, he was probably at least conceptually right in that the Amazon was significantly populated, maybe even densely populated at the time. And that population pretty much disappeared when the Europeans brought smallpox and a number of other diseases to those vulnerable populations. So the population of South America essentially dropped by 90% over the course of a century. And so you're talking about millions of people that lived in this forest. And what has emerged particularly from remote sensing measurements of the Amazonian landscape, is that they seem to have a completely different relationship with the landscape from the one that we've developed, and therefore a completely different relationship with water and with the water landscape. So we essentially became sedentary and developed agriculture and ways of living that were based on the domestication of individual species. When we domesticated wheat, or when we domesticated a specific subset of animals, we really provided the basis for the agricultural economy that began in the Bronze Age and brought us all the way to the 1900s, essentially. Right now, the populations in the Amazon didn't domesticate individual species; they effectively domesticated the entire landscape. And so, as a result, the reconstructions that we know of paint a picture of a forest in which many people lived, where people modified the landscape, creating mounds and catchments and infrastructure, essentially earth-built infrastructure, that would catch the flooding waters, collect fisheries, freshwater fisheries, as a storage of protein for the population. They would then build orchards and grow fruit trees on these embankments, and really had a sort of integrated landscape that wasn't separated, as we tend to do, between an urban landscape and a rural landscape. Right now, then that disappeared in a matter of about a century. Most of those people died off, and all that was left were, in fact, a few villages. And we know they died off, and we can estimate how many people ended up disappearing, because you can see in the carbon of the atmosphere in the paleoclimatological record, you can see a dip in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that corresponds to the regrowth of the Amazon when all that population disappeared. But that fact, the idea that there was this kind of completely parallel track, a completely different way of relating to the environment, one that didn't require something that we're incredibly familiar with, which is the separation between urban and rural societies, something that's so ingrained in Western and in our Western culture that you can trace it back all the way to Enkidu and Gilgamesh, in 3000 BCE. It was really striking and quite interesting. Now, Bianca, I don't know whether that was a moment of levity or I managed to kind of make it weightier than you wanted, but I found that as sort of an extraordinary story.
It is extraordinary, and it does feel as though there's probably quite a lot to be learned from the way that they integrated nature into their way of living rather than sought to master it as we have done. So the questions have begun coming through on the Q&A. So we're going to start with Joanna. Most people think of dangers related to water in terms of droughts or floods or tsunamis, but what are some of the less widely known dangers related to water that should be more broadly known and discussed?
Right. Well, there's two aspects to this question. One is, so technical answer, which has to do with public health. Water is still today the most important vector of disease. And so therefore the provision of clean water is the most important driver of public health, right? It's the single, even in the pandemic, we saw this is one of the three things you had to do is wash your hands. And whilst we may forget that this is a problem in countries that have a decent supply of clean water, most of the world doesn't, right? There are 800 million people that don't have access to any clean water close to where they live, and about 3 billion people on the planet that have, impaired, water supply and sanitation. And that has enormous public health implications and costs, right? I mean, 1 million kids die every year because of dysentery and other diseases that are connected to water that's not clean. But there's an additional sort of footnote to the story, which is the experience of America has shown us that those risks are not far from us. What's happened in America, and people might have heard of the story of Flint, for example, is that the provision of clean water is an expensive proposition, is expensive business, and it requires mutualizing the costs in a large enough population that you can make it affordable for everybody. In American places like Flint, what's happened is that these smaller communities simply do not have a tax base that's big enough to pay for the kind of infrastructure they would need to provide clean water. There are other things going on, of course. You can talk about corruption. I mean, it's a complicated story, but fundamentally this issue that we need collective underwriting in order to provide safe water and sanitation is an important thing, and we're never too far from the risk that somebody will fall off the cliff of accessing those services. And so it's always important, particularly in the sanitation side. And so it's always important to keep an eye on that. The second risk, which is a more political risk, but it's important to always remember it, is that when we give institutions the power to solve water problems for us, we give them enormous power on our landscape. We give them authority. For example, in the past, governments, as a matter of course, exercised eminent domain of large fragments, large landscapes, in order to build reservoirs or canals, or in order to convey water from one place to another, right? Now, those days have long gone, and they're not in the memory of most people alive today, but they were happening in the 30s and 40s when there was this problem of dealing with the natural environment that was very variable, and you needed to provide a stable, secure, stationary environment for people to live a modern life, right? If the climate system changes enough that we'll once again get our feet wet on a regular basis, then we will be tempted to entrust that power to somebody, and say, just solve it for us. But we should remember that there will be choices, and very difficult ones. And that is a risk that people don't talk about, but the sort of citizenship oversight is crucially important in all decisions about the landscape. And I think most of our societies have lost the ability to intermediate that governance. And so to me, that's a major risk.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. I'm going to jump now to Simon's question. And it reminds me, Simon, when I worked for Giulio, one of the things I used to do was go running to him every time I saw an interesting news story that somehow had some kind of relevance to water. And one of them was the towing of icebergs. So Simon's question is, water is a natural resource, so why can't it be exploited in the same way that oil has been? For example, couldn't Greenland export the increasing amounts of fresh meltwater now available due to climate warming to those that need it, or potentially solving several problems like Greenland's economy, possibly greening arid regions, slowing global warming? Another version of towing the iceberg to the Sahara. So why hasn't that happened? Could it happen? What are the obstacles to it happening?
Yeah, so that's that's a very good question, and one has to remember that the distinction, the story of oil is a story of a very valuable molecule. If you think of the value of oil at the pump, or the value of the plastic that comes from oil in the in the bag that you might use or whatever, most of the value is in the molecule, in the organic molecule that comes out of the oil well. In the case of water, the value is not in the molecule, it's in access to it. Right? Much of the value and most of the cost is built into getting the molecule from where it is to where you need it at the time that you need it. And so it turns out that dragging a piece of ice from Greenland or from Antarctica or from the Arctic towards, say, the UK would cost far more than is conceivable we would be willing to pay for water. It's the same argument that suggests, you could in principle say, well, there's tons of water in the ocean. Can't we just desalinate it, right? But you have to remember that 98+% of the water use that we make is for food production, right? We use water to grow food. Now, if you were to desalinate water or, tow an iceberg in order to use the meltwater to produce food, you'd have to charge the food with that cost. And it turns out that if you run the numbers, that cost would make most food unaffordable, which then, in a world in which already today some 800-900 million people are already food insecure, would push many, many people off the food security ledge. So the nexus between energy, water, and food makes the water issue not just a technical problem, but a public policy problem and a security issue. Just to give you a sense of scale, if you think about, a reservoir to catch rain that comes from the sky, and then a conveyance canal that might bring water from that reservoir to some field or some city, the raw water prior to treatment will cost probably 1 or 2 pence per cubic meter. If you were to take a desalinated cubic meter, that would currently cost you £1. So you're talking about 100 times more, and then you'd have to move it from the coast upstream, because anytime you move from the coast you're going uphill, and of course water is heavy, it's about 1 ton per cubic meter, so you'd have to expend energy to then drag it to wherever you need it, and by the time you get there your water might cost you £3-4 per cubic meter. That has happened, by the way, in Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia for a while used its oil to run desal plants and then pump the water up from the coast to Riyadh. And the cost of that water ended up being $4 or $5 per cubic meter, which makes it, at the margins affordable for some, but not affordable for everybody, and certainly not affordable for the food system. And so for all those reasons, whilst technically possible, it's economically feasible.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions to get through and not much time. So this one I know is very close to your heart and areas of expertise in its relationship to water security. Question from Walter about water treatment and water recycling in densely populated areas. What's the human impact and the equity issues that surround that?
Well, so, water recycling, so now we're talking about delivering water to people that live in cities. That's a fraction, it's a small amount of water compared to the total use of water in a country. As I said, most of it is for agriculture and then for industry, and only third for municipal use. But it's very important use, right? Because we depend on it for our life. And it has to be of a very high quality. It has to be treated, tertiary treated, in fact, to be delivered. And so in that context, it turns out the water recycling is actually quite an interesting solution for that problem. And there are cities around the world, if you ever been to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, 90+% of the water that you would be showering with has been recycled. And it turns out that the cost of recycling kind of gray or black waters from an urban setting is lower than desalinating water, because the molecules involved are bigger. And so it takes less energy to clean it. And so recycling is a growing option for urban centers. The equity issue is important, because there is then a tendency to say, oh, well, then I'll just have a treatment works in the basement of my building or my house, and everybody will have a distributed kind of little solution that sits in their home. And the problem is that water is a public utility. And it's quite important that everybody has access to it, right? You can't cut off somebody's access to water simply because they can't afford it. And the way in which we solve that problem is to have centralized public utilities that deliver water at the same price to everybody. If you start concentrating the technology in those hands that can afford it, you run the risk of leaving some people out. And so there's a technological aspect to this, but there's also a very important equity aspect to this.
Thank you. We're racing through now. Anne Vroom asks if you have any thoughts about the role of the IMF, World Bank and sovereign wealth funds participating in water management issues.
Well, they've historically played a colossally important role, because they were the underwriter of choice for all those countries that didn't have a traded currency or that didn't have enough of a tax base to be able to underwrite the construction of water infrastructure. Water infrastructure is expensive, lasts for a long time. If you build it, you might end up becoming rich on the back of it, but you have to be rich to build it. And so you need a financial institution to lend you the money. And in most cases, the World Bank and the IMF played that role. Historically, in the 50s and 60s in particular, when Eugene Black was running the World Bank, it was the dominant financier of water in the world. In fact, the Indus Treaty, the way in which Pakistan and India share the Indus, is largely down to the intermediation of the World Bank. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is that the World Bank and the IMF are no longer the only institutions that lend money for these projects to developing countries. As I said earlier, China has now rapidly become the principal lender of finance for the construction of infrastructure, water infrastructure around the world. And that has meant that they've been able to export also their model, the blueprint of how you would do it. So the World Bank has, it's an institution that has on its board all the countries of the world. So it has enormous legitimacy. It has an important role to play, but it's much diminished compared to where it was, 30, 40 years ago.
Thank you. I sort of hope that this is the last question, but also please don't stop sending questions if you have them. But this is a rather beautiful one. Catherine has asked if you can speak more to humanity's spiritual connection to water and how that shows up through the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important theme, because in the end, I tried to make the argument, even though we've sort of spent some time talking about technical answers here, most of the book is about trying to make the argument that the issues of water are not technical issues. They're political and maybe even ethical and possibly moral, right? They are about values. They're about what we believe. And so the book tries to explore many of those topics, and it does so by trying to build a history of ideas. And so I start with ideas that are steeped in essentially religious beliefs, right? The first societies had as their organizing principle theocracy. So temples were the sort of organizing total institution of a Sumerian society, for example, and that's where the relationship with water was defined. You get to the Abrahamic tradition, which has enormous importance for us in the West and for Islamic countries. The Abrahamic tradition has a very, very particular relationship to water because it developed in the Levant, where scarcity was the order of the day. And in fact, in the book, I try to make some arguments which don't originate with me, but that try to tie even monotheism to the particular environmental conditions. I'm always careful in the book not to be an environmental determinist. I'm never claiming that the environment single-handedly determined what happened. We have agency, but the environment, environmental conditions, and water conditions shaped the way in which our ideas developed, all the way to the struggles that the Victorians had as a rather pious but imperial society, trying to wrestle with the legacy of, you know, empires of the past in justifying its work in India and Egypt during the Protectorate. So, you know, short, you know, please do read the book, but there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of culture. I'm not a pantheist, and I don't make an argument for a particular view of the relationship with water, but I do think that water is a cultural experience first.
I think, Anthony, if it's all right with you, we don't have any more questions, just a couple of comments. I think that's a wonderful question to end on. Giulio, do you have any closing thoughts before we hand back to Anthony?
No, I mean, I could keep going for hours here. So, you know, somebody I think asked a question about the sort of Palestinian and Israeli issues in the Jordan River. I just saw in the Q&A. There's an entire chapter on that. So first thing I would say in the few seconds that remain is go and read the book. But that story, you know, let me just close on this. You know, my experience of water, it's easy to talk about water wars. You know, it's a sort of common trope. In reality, water leads more frequently to cooperation than it does to war and conflict. In a way, because it's so important, it's too important to allow individual states to fight over it. There are exceptions to that, and indeed, the story of the Jordan, in many ways, is a story of war, despite the opportunities for cooperation. But those stories are inseparable. They're not just about the environment; they're about the relationship society develops with the environment and the institutions that result from that. It's those institutions that then drive the conflict. And so what I hope I've done, you know, in these brief few minutes, but also in the book, is reveal that, you know, this is not a story of scientists telling us what to do. It's a story of politics and history. It's a story of it's language that is the same language you use to author our own lives. That's the language in which we have to describe water, and I hope people will sort of read the book and, you know, draw their own conclusions from what they should believe and what we should do next.